Hello, my treasures. With March of the Lich King coming out today, I figured it would be a great time to showcase some day one decks that you can actually try out. I did something very similar to this in the past with Murder in Castle Nathria with a bunch of Keltis combo decks. However, this time we are going to just be focusing around the entire set instead of one card in particular. Though I did want to originally get at least 3 Death Knight decks within this video, I just didn't have enough time. So let's begin with the first one, Blood Decay, where this version is going to be centered around 2 cards and getting as many copies of them as humanly possible. The first one being Alexandros Mograine, so you can do incredibly large amounts of damage to your opponent's face in each individual turn. And Vampiric Blood to make your HP pool as big as you can possibly get through cards like School Teacher or even your Amalgams of the Deep in order to get additional copies of your key undeads. And in order to survive all your opponent's hits, we are running a bunch of early game removal tools and late game removal tools to AoE board clear or protect our face from our opponent. And now for the next class, which is going to be Druid. And while I was really looking forward to do something with Armor Druid, I figured a really funny one would be to try to do something with Elwyn Boar. It's been a while since I've built a deck around this card, and figured we could take a note out of Reese's Wheelhouse and instead use the same idea in Druid, where we're going to be using Unending Swarm in order to revive all of our Elwyn Boars that died earlier in the game, while also relying on a really tight curve in order to guarantee us a draw of the Unending Swarm out of something like Capture Coldtooth Mine, help us draw into the boars really early on in the game. This deck centers around a bunch of really nice draw power that allows this deck to be really consistent in theory, and also does use a bunch of cards to generate you some late game threats if the sword isn't enough to actually do anything. We also aren't really relying on any token generating cards, so we don't flood the pool of Unending Swarm, as we do want to try to make it as consistent as humanly possible within Druid. In theory, you should be able to get 4 out really easily if you use the 2 boars plus something like the Oracle of Elune, and then use a Wild Pyromancer to kill them all off. All of the cards in this deck either give you early game removal tools, draw you into additional cards, or allow you to access into your combo really quickly. So if you're a fan of Elwyn Boar, then try this one out. The next deck that I have is going to be for Demon Hunter, which is going to be a questline Outcast Demon Hunter deck. A lot of the cards in Standard that have Outcast on them also are draw cards, thus making a perfect combination between these two ideas. This is also using some of the Fell package in order to have a big payoff in the form of Jace, or even a Relic package in order to draw through our cards even quicker. There should be plenty of ways in this deck to discount a lot of your key combo cards, and maybe even get a use out of the Bloodthorn legendary that bounces back to your hand every time you play a Outcast card. There's a lot of ways to easily abuse a lot of the Outcast cards within Standard, and this is probably one of the better ways to try to actually do it. All right, the next class that we're going to cover is going to be Hunter, with a Hunter buff deck in order to try to get King Crush as big as humanly possible, using things like Hope of Quel'Tha Loss and our Lothar Therian in order to buff all the minions within our deck. And because there are only really 4 weapons for Hunter within Standard right now, we're going to also be using Pack Kodo in order to try to generate additional copies of Hope of Quel'Tha Loss, and then also use the Northshire Farmers in order to get more additional copies, thus in theory allowing us to go infinite with the amount of Quel'Tha Loss that we actually get, while finishing our opponents off with a huge King Crush in the final turn, while also having other minions such as Twin Fin Twin and Encumbered Pack Mule in order to get double the amount of stats off of any buffs that you actually give your minions within your deck. This is honestly probably going to be one of the first decks that I actually try out, because I really like the idea of trying to make King Crush as big as humanly possible, and this is probably the best way to do it, while also using a bunch of new cards and some old cards that really just haven't had enough support to make them that useful yet, such as Pack Kodo. Now for the next class. This is going to be Mage, where we're going to be revisiting the questline. However, we are going to be adding a little bit of a twist, using the casino package that was introduced within this set. To use cards like Grand Magister Ramethith as a huge payoff. There are also plenty of other cards that were added within the recent sets that also help out the idea of a casino mage anyways, such as cards like Spell Coiler, Runic Orb, Babbling Book, or even Suspicious Alchemist. Additional targets for questline, which will make our individual spells that we randomly generate a lot better if we actually complete the questline with the 2 additional spell damage we get at the end of it. We also are going to be using a very small hero power package within this deck, just so we have some type of AoE board clear, and then also using Deathborn as a way to generate additional threats on our own board if we do complete our questline, and it serves as a way to trigger the frost steps of our quest. And now for the next class, it is going to be Paladin. Paladin, we are going to be trying to do something with pirates. And when I say pirates, we're mainly trying to use something with Blood Matriarch Leandrin in order to buff our entire deck with a bunch of divine shields and rush to the minions that we normally don't have the rush on. There's a bunch of ways to easily abuse the divine shield synergy that we have, such as Prismatic Jewel Kit in order to buff up all the minions in our hand, thus making things like Mistress Might way better. Though I do realize in this version of the deck, I am not using the Cariel legendary, so we will probably be swapping a card out for that. But the general idea of this deck is to buff up all of our minions and then use Mistress Might to give them all charge. Now for the next class, it's going to be a OTK deck, which is going to be Priest. Priest, we are going to be centered around Sister Savalin. I probably mispronounced it, but it is what it is. We're going to be using a elemental package in order to discount the Radiant Elementals within the deck and generate additional copies. I know some people would rather use things like Raise Dead in order to get guaranteed copies of the Radiant Elemental, but that does lower the amount of draw power you can have within the deck, as you do not want to run any type of 3 or lower minions. In this version of the deck, we are going to be mainly relying on Mulligan of the Depths in order to get us additional copies of the Radiant Elementals, so we can just go infinite with 3 Radiant Elementals on board whenever we do get the Vision of Darkness within our hand. We also are running a bunch of draw power in order to draw through our deck to try to get our cards as quickly as humanly possible, and running a bunch of AoE board clears. If you want some more direct damage within the deck itself, you could swap something out like Gift of the Naru for Void Shards in order to make this a little bit better in that. But I do like the additional draw power that Gift of the Naru actually gives, especially if you get a Cyrilla in order to nuke your opponent's board. Now for the next class, it is going to be Rogue, where we're going to do something with Rotten Rodent and a bunch of Death Rattle synergy. Death Rattle synergy in Rogue has really been a mechanic that has been supported in so many sets, but has yet to reach critical mass where it is a very meta-relevant deck. However, between Rotten Rodent and Scourge Illusioners, I think this is probably the perfect time to try something like this out, as both of those cards do allow you to discount really expensive death rattles whenever you do draw into them, using cards like Smokescreen in order to draw a huge amount of minions, while also generating a bunch of onboard threats through all of the additional summons that you are going to get off of those death rattles that you drew out of your deck. We're also using things like Shadow Step in order to bounce back the Rotten Rodents in order to discount our deck even further, as Mana Cheat is always really nice, especially in Rogue where you're not really normally looking for a really expensive deck to play. Now for a really wacky deck, Shaman, we are going to be revisiting the questline for, because we did get a little bit of additional overload synergy within the set. However, this is probably going to be the last chance we actually get to use the questline before it rotates out, and I very much doubt that we'll see any additional overload support within the mini set, as it doesn't seem like Blizzard really wants to make this into a fully functional deck. But we are going to be trying to OTK our opponents using Shadow Suffusion, which gives a death rattle that does 3 damage to a random enemy. And if you have a way to actually AoE your opponent's board in order to clear it out and then guarantee face, then you can do a certain amount of damage using things like Schooling in order to generate you a bunch of the fish that you will give the death rattle to, and then each cast of the Shadow Suffusion is going to give them 6 damage instead of 3. And then if you have other ways to duplicate that from that point forward, you can OTK your opponent really, really quickly. This does rely on your opponent having minions on board to actually do, but I do think this is a fun little twist on a stereotypical questline Shaman deck. Now for a class and a deck that I've been really wanting to push for quite a long time, which is Taunt Warrior, where we're also going to be using an Enrage package in order to buff up our taunts that we put on our board, using things like Last Stand and Bulk Up in order to get additional stats on our key taunt minions, such as Morshan Elite or our Encumbered Pack Mules. Both of these allow you to get double the value on any buffs that you actually give them. You also use a Enrage package, so you can use some of the Fire Warrior support that was introduced within the set, such as Light of the Phoenix that draws you 2 cards but is reduced by every single damage minion you actually have on board, or Sun Fury Champion that acts as the perfect way to AoE buff up your board if you also have access to Imbued Axe. I do know on the screen this version is running a Weapons Expert, but the version that I'm going to be leaving down below is going to have Last Stand instead of Weapons Expert. But if you want the Weapons Expert back in the deck, swap them out for the Silver Moon Sentinels, as this will raise the consistency level of the key taunt minions that you want to actually buff up in this deck, while also giving you access to your key weapon really, really easily. Finally, for a deck that I have no idea if this is going to work or not. If it works, it's going to be incredibly, incredibly funny, but if it doesn't, then we shall see. The reason why I say I don't know if it'll work or not is Amorphous Slime gives the death rattle of summoning whatever discarded off of it, and I don't know how in combination with Tasman's Phylactery this is actually going to work. The idea is basically to use the slime in order to get additional copies of Darkon, so you can actually hit your opponent for 6 damage per additional copy that you actually randomly generate. However, if this doesn't actually work, you are going to want to swap out the Tasman Phylactery package for something completely different, and maybe go for more of a discard Warlock angle. However, you could in theory use a Vander Warlock deck instead, because both Slime and Drakon are higher than a 4-cost card, and then use a bunch of early game removal and ways to generate additional copies of the Drakon or even the Slime's own death rattle through things like Shallow Grave, as seen in this deck, or even Devourer of Souls. There's a lot of possibilities to try to make a deck like this work. However, again, I have no idea if this one is going to work in the end, which is probably why I will probably test this out really, really early on, since I do have a Golden Drakthar, and I really, really, really want to use him in some type of deck. I just need to figure out if something like this actually works, and if it doesn't, then we will move on to a different idea. Alright, so those were all the decks that I prepared for the March of the Lich King release. Let me know down below which ones you're most looking forward to maybe playing, or maybe what other decks that you were looking forward to playing that I didn't actually cover in this video. Also, let me know down below if you like this style of video where I prepare a bunch of decks before a set actually comes out, and when in the release cycle you would prefer to have something like this, if release day is really good, or maybe a week earlier when everyone's doing their theorycrafts streams. And like always, if you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, bye bye.